for joining us and for your flexibility in joining us on this on Teams instead of Zoom. As I shared, we had a bit of an unexpected event this morning. So our typical sort of host for these webinars is out of the office today. So Amy and I are going to do our best to sort of go through the content today, and then we will also share the full slides and recording that will cover sort of everything you need to know. But let me start off with introductions. Good morning. I'm Kimberly Howard. I'm a director with the Homeless Services Division at the Department of Family and Support Services, and I will pass over to my colleague, Amy.
I will unmute myself. Amy Cornell, project manager with the Department of Family and Support Services in the Homeless Service Division, working on shelter infrastructure improvements.
Great. So this morning, this webinar is the pre-proposal webinar for the Shelter Infrastructure Initiative RFP that was just released. I will sort of kick off with housekeeping and then pass over to Amy, who will be covering most of the content today. I think as we go through, please feel free to drop questions in the chat, and we will sort of either answer those immediately if they're easy, or take them to the end. I think we also anticipate we may get some questions from you all today that we can't answer immediately, so we will take those back, and any questions that we answer or that we need to provide answers on will be sent out with written responses as an amendment to the RFP in a few weeks. So thanks again for your flexibility. I will kick us off into housekeeping. Please keep yourself muted, just given the number of folks we have on the call. But again, please feel free to put questions in the chat or raise your hand if you want to come off mute. This webinar is being recorded, so we will share that recording and the slides out afterward. One key thing is, this webinar is really to clarify the RFP document. It is not to provide new information from what was provided in the RFP. So any changes and any clarifications coming out of questions on this webinar will be provided in a written addendum. And then, we'll post a copy of the recording on the YouTube channel, and we retain the right to share a list of registrants on this webinar. This is a unique RFP in that it's only eligible to qualified applicants. So that will be a smaller group. Okay, and so what's on our agenda today? We've done quick intros, and really I'm gonna hand over to Amy to walk through sort of some of the key things we wanted to highlight from the RFP. So she'll go through sort of purpose, background, goals, some of the funding parameters and eligible costs, some of the attachments that we're requesting as part of this RFP, and sort of specific guidance around that. The piece that Amy and I will not cover today is the sort of technical assistance for applicants on using e-procurement. We will share out those slides so you can see sort of the written version of that, but we are not prepared to give guidance on that today. I do think I'm less worried about this group, given that you all successfully submitted an RFQ and have worked with DFSS in the past. But we will share sort of contact information for any questions on the TA component of how to actually submit an application in the city's e-procurement platform. Okay, and with that, I'm going to hand over to Amy.
Thank you, Kim. Okay, good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for finding us this morning. And again, our apologies for the technical challenges. This is always an interesting project, and today is no exception. So appreciate that you're here. It's been a while since we've met, and so welcome back. We're really excited to be at this phase of the RFP and appreciate all of your efforts to date. The slides have a lot of information in them, and I'm going to just briefly cover the most important points. All of the information is in the RFP that is on the slide. So if I don't cover it, it's in the RFP. And just for introductions, if you could put your name and the organization and the shelter that qualified, or if you're not with a shelter, just you can leave that out. But if you could put that in the chat, that would be great. And on to the purpose of the RFP. So as you know, uh, DFSS's Shelter Infrastructure Initiative is seeking to fund high impact renovation projects that create sustainable improvements in the shelter system. Specifically, we are looking to fund projects that create safer, less congregate, more accessible facilities, and also increase bed capacity when feasible. Only shelter operators that qualified for funding through the Phase 1 RFQ and project readiness review processes are invited to submit an RFP for this funding opportunity. And grants awarded under this RFP must be used for capital expenses only, not for ongoing shelter operations. Next slide, please. Background. So you all are quite familiar with the RFP activities completed so far since you've lived through it. But briefly, in February of 23, DFSS released the RFQ for existing shelter operators in Chicago, and we received 15 applications, of which 10 were deemed qualified for this funding, and all 10 of your projects, you all decided to move forward with the phase 2, which we're just in the middle of winding up now. So since then, all of you have been working with IFF to develop schematic drawings with architects, getting cost estimates from general contractors, and to perform the required environmental site assessments with environmental consultants. Next slide, please. And the goals you're also familiar with, I'm sure. We've got 3 main goals of advancing a non-congregate and more accessible shelter strategy, sustaining and improving the quality of current shelter facilities, and replenishing lost beds to pre-COVID levels when possible, based on system-wide needs. It's important to know that it's DFSS's expectation that projects will not compromise day-to-day operations of the shelter programs. So what this means is we're asking shelter operators to provide a relocation or an on-site plan for keeping residents, staff, and others safe during construction, and also to provide a plan for how the agency will ensure successful day-to-day operations while managing the construction project. Next slide. Funding parameters. Okay, so qualified shelters can achieve the strict definition of non-congregate shelter and qualify for the maximum funding level at $100,000 per bed. For that strict non-congregate unit, for those strict non-congregate units, and all other projects will be capped at 80,000 per bed based on total beds in the program at construction completion. Project funding is capped at 10 million per location. However, up to an additional 5 million may be matched 1-to-1 by DFSS for leverage funds dedicated to this capital improvement project. And evidence of those leveraged funds must be provided in writing and submitted with this RFP. DFSS may award partial funding for components of a proposed project, most aligned with the goals of this funding opportunity. And proposed capital improvements must be aligned with projects initially proposed in your RFQ. and findings from the phase 1 facility assessment and project readiness review. Next slide. Oh, no, I'm sorry, one more. So this is key. Any key differences in what your agency proposed in the RFQ from this proposal must address new funding requirements. So one of those was, for example, the accessible isolation sleeping room with an in-unit full bathroom. That was a new requirement post RFQ release, or a justifiable external factor such as required environmental remediation that was unexpected, or you've leveraged additional funding to expand the scope of the project that you proposed. Now for the next slide, thank you. So capital project eligible costs include demolition, hard costs of construction renovation, soft costs for professional services like architects, structural engineers, and financing fees. Site improvements like installing utilities or renovating offices or laundry rooms, things like that. And relocation costs may be available for shelter operators that must relocate clients during construction, but DFSS highly recommends that if there's any possible way that operators can secure resources to support relocation, that would be really important. So shelter infrastructure funded projects must comply with the restricted use period by continuing to provide shelter at the site for 10 years. The city has the first right of refusal to purchase the site if your agency plans to sell the site, and that ensures that that site will continue as a shelter moving forward, even if it's sold. Next slide. Okay, splitting out home ARP activities from non-eligible activities. This is so important, and I know you all have been working on this. But as you know, DFSS has two funding sources for this initiative. We have 20 million in home ARP funds and 20 million in locally issued general obligation bonds. We are requesting that all applications split out eligible costs for home ARP from non-eligible activities and associated costs. So I know you all are working on that, and it's critical that those funds are properly split. So home ARP eligible activities, home ARP may fund one, several, or all non-congregate shelter units in a project, but home ARP funds can only assist those non-congregate units. So what that means is 100% of home ARP funds used to develop non-congregate units must be designated as home ARP units throughout the restricted 10-year period. In a project that features both congregate and non-congregate units, costs must be accurately allocated to the home ARP units and the portion of the upgrade costs directly serving those non-congregate units. And finally, home ARP non-congregate projects must meet and maintain the minimum home ARP property standards through the restricted use period. So shelters awarded home ARP funding must also abide by the Fair Housing Act that prohibits discrimination based on race, color, religion, national origin, sex, familial status, or disability, and requires landlords, you all, to make reasonable accommodations and modifications for tenants with disabilities. Next slide, please. Okay, program requirements. All all proposed projects must include the following: at least one ADA accessible sleeping room with an in-unit full bathroom, which means sink, toilet, shower, that can be used for isolation of clients. Also, at least one full private bathroom that is accessible for use by all clients. At least one water closet, lavatory, and bathtub/shower must be supplied for each 10 occupants. At least one private lockable room with a sink for use by healthcare providers is required. At least 5% of the shelter's bathrooms must be ADA accessible. And at least 2% of the shelter's bedrooms and bathrooms must be ADA communication units, such as having ADA fire alarm strobes. Residents in non-congregate units must be assigned one sleeping room/bed for the duration of their stay and have access to those rooms throughout the day. But exceptions can be made for clients in need of isolation due to a contagious disease, if they have a need for an ADA bedroom bathroom, or if there are unresolvable conflicts with roommates. No grant awards will be made until shelter operators complete the environmental review, regardless of the funding source. And so this is critical. Please note that assigning contracts, procuring equipment, and committing funds prior to receiving environmental clearance from, now it's 2FM, will be considered a choice limiting action, and any choice limiting actions taken by the shelter will result in denial of home ARP funds. So that is critical to keep in mind. Next slide, please. Okay, grantees must also comply with requirements for minority and women-owned business enterprises, city residency requirements, prevailing wage, and property and habitability standards. Next slide, please. There we go. Minimum property standards. All sleeping units in common areas must meet all applicable state and local codes, ordinances, and requirements, including Chicago's building code for sleeping room sizes, which is in this chart here, as well as HUD's applicable provisions. Each individual or family must have an acceptable space to sleep, non-congregate when feasible, which includes adequate space and security for themselves and their belongings. Shelters must have a natural or mechanical means of ventilation to keep the air free of pollutants. And all sleeping units must have a manually or electronically operable window. And any exceptions must be pre-approved by DFSS. So windows in all the sleeping units. Next slide, please. Thank you. Minimum rehabilitation standards. Okay, I'm focusing on ongoing property standards and inspections. Please know that the city will conduct ongoing annual inspections to verify that the project meets the minimum property standards throughout the 10-year restricted use period. If there are life-threatening deficiencies, the owners must correct those deficiencies immediately. If the recipient moves the shelter to a new site or structure, that new site or structure must meet all the same standards for the remaining period that DFSS funds are used for operating expenses. And if a grantee is no longer receiving DFSS funding for shelter operations, during that 10-year restricted use period, you are still required to report annually to show that your property is still meeting the minimum rehabilitation standards. for this grant. Next slide, please. Okay, this is information that is new to you all. This is our selection criteria for the RFP and how we will be scoring your submission. One of the criteria is strength of proposed program, and it's being assigned 25 points. So DFSS will evaluate applications based on the following criteria, including the respondents' proposed capital improvement projects to the shelter program's facility must be in line with the program requirements and adequately describes the schematic/concept drawing, highlighting the high impact proposed changes. The respondent proposed project will transition to the facility to a more non-congregate setting. The respondent's proposed project will increase ADA accessibility of the facility. The respondent's proposed project will increase or sustain the total number of shelter beds. And the respondent's proposed project is aligned with the original shelter infrastructure RFQ proposals or justifies key differences if applicable. Next slide, please. Organizational capacity. That is assigned 30 points. And what we are looking for is the respondent has adequate systems and processes to support monitoring program expenditures and fiscal controls and collecting and securely storing data. The respondent has a relocation plan or on-site plan to keep residents, staff, and others safe during construction. The respondent provides a plan to ensure successful day-to-day operations while managing the construction project. And the respondent has a plan if unexpected costs come up throughout the course of the project. Such an example is a financial support to implement the construction safety relocation plan. Next slide, please. Okay, reasonable costs, budget justification, and leverage of funds is 45 points. And we are looking at that the respondent has a budget that explains how proposed soft costs are relevant to the proposed work and are eligible costs. And as you know, if you've looked at the budget template, it breaks out the home ARP funding eligible costs from non-eligible costs. The respondent has a budget also explaining how proposed hard costs are relevant to the proposed work and are eligible costs. The respondent has project costs that are in line with the shelter initiative's eligible per bed funding rate. As I said, maximum level of funding at 100,000 per bed for strict non-congregate units, and all other projects are capped at 80,000 per bed. The respondent provides additional funding to support total project cost. So if you've leveraged city, state, federal, foundation, corporate, individual donations, and kind contributions, we're definitely interested in seeing if projects can be leveraged, and points will be awarded for that. The respondent provides an adequate plan for filling any identified funding gaps, including justification for project costs that are greater than the project's eligible per bed funding rate with supportive documentation. Next slide, please. Okay, so the attachments that are required, respondents should submit one application for each project in iSupplier. Respondents must also submit the following components as part of their RFP application. So be sure to attach all the customary DFSS RFP documents such as proof of current liability insurance, proof of your current SAM unique ID number, current certificate of good standing from the state of Illinois, current bylaws and articles of incorporation, most recent financial statement or audit, IRS determination letter, and a list of your current board members. New slide. Thank you. Respondents must also submit the following attachments specific to the Shelter Infrastructure Initiative. So be sure to attach your completed version of the budget template, Shelter Infrastructure Initiative. Again, make sure to designate home ARP eligible costs versus home ARP ineligible costs. Make sure all program requirements are addressed. If you have matching or leverage funds, make sure you provide evidence of that through uh, um, a letter that we actually show a template that you can use that's at within the RFP. Also be sure to attach copies of evidence of legal and site due diligence, such as all of the site assessment documents required by 2FM for environmental clearance, zoning and or special use permit documents as applicable, site surveys as applicable, and structural testing also as applicable. And be sure to attach copies of the architect concept or schematic design drawing and copies of the general contractor cost estimate. Also, please include evidence of the vendor's appropriate skills and experiences related to the development of shelters or similar facilities. This should be stated on the firm's letterhead, and make sure that costs are broken down by line item listed in the budget template. Okay, next slide. Okay, these are just some snippets of what the budget template looks like. On the left, the budget summary tab requests information about the applicant, the site information, including site conditions, meaning total beds existing at present, total non-congregate beds, units with fewer unrelated clients, and the number of isolation rooms with in-unit full baths. Also, what the proposed conditions are related to those factors. And then also make sure you include sources, uses, project cost summary. And on the right, the budget development cost tab requests cost calculations per bed, construction/renovation hard costs, professional fees and other costs, soft costs, construction financing fees, furniture, fixture, and equipment. And there is a FFE tab also for those related costs. Next slide. Oh, you know what? I missed 2 points on the last slide. I'll just, oh, thank you. Division of hard, did I? No, I lied. Next slide. Thank you. Division hard cost tab asks you to split out costs between home ARP eligible versus home ARP ineligible activities in the division hard cost tab. Line items are based on common terminology used for construction estimates/budgets. Next slide. Advances. We're super excited to be able to offer this option for you all as we continue to do our best to ensure that shelters aren't overwhelmed by pre-development costs. So this is an exciting opportunity. The city will consider providing an advance of up to 25% of the total grant award upfront at the execution of the contract. And respondents will need to indicate whether they wish to exercise this option. The grantee will be responsible for expending funds on eligible activities and providing documentation to DFSS on expenditures, and any costs incurred with advanced funds that are not in line with requirements of this RFP will require the grantee to reimburse the city for the disallowed costs. Next slide. Matching funds and required documentation. So DFSS may match funds 1-to-1 up to 5 million per shelter site beyond the 10 million total cap and 80 to 100,000 slash per bed caps based on available funds and an individual review of each project's capital deck. So evidence of committed funding sources must be submitted with the RFP in order to qualify for those matching funds. For funds committed by the qualified agency, so your own funds from cash reserves or fundraising efforts, you must let us know in the RFP what amount is committed by your agency. Also for funds committed by another entity, such as a federal agency, state agency, or private funds, must also be documented and demonstrate that funding is committed by the time of the RFP submission, and funding will be received in full prior to construction completion. Next slide. The evaluation process. So projects will be evaluated on the strengths of the proposal and the responsiveness to the selection criteria. Failure to submit a complete proposal or respond fully to all requirements may make your submission subject to rejection. The commissioner, upon review of recommended agency or agencies, may reject, deny, or recommend agencies that have applied for grants based on previous performance and/or area need. DFSS reserves the right to ensure that all mandated services are available citywide and provided in a linguistically and culturally appropriate manner. And DFSS will review and approve all project proposals and has the right to require scope changes on a case-by-case basis. Next slide. Selection and transition timeline. Okay, pre-proposal webinar. It actually is happening despite a rocky start. The due date to submit pre-proposal questions is actually January 3rd. We extended the date from December 26th a week. So the new date is Friday, January 3rd by 5 p.m. for your questions. And the RFP application is due January 31st, 2025 by noon. DFSS will make Shelter Infrastructure Initiative grant awards through a two-phase process. First, provisional awards, and then grant awards and contract execution. So for provisional awards, DFSS will make provisional grant awards based on eligibility criteria. DFSS will execute non-legally binding agreements prior to completion of the environmental review process. The non-legally binding agreement or provisional award will define activities and documents required to receive a shelter infrastructure initiative grant award and contains stipulations that ensures qualified shelters do not have a legal claim to any amount of funds to be used for the specific project or site until the environmental review process is satisfactorily completed. So that's provisional awards, and then the actual granting of the awards and contract execution, as I've been saying, requires 2FM environmental and also the NEPA clearance, which is part of the environmental site assessment process required by HUD home art funds. And DFSS will execute contracts with shelter grantees upon approved scope and budgets based on provisional awards. And next slide. As I said, the applications are due on January 31st, 2025 by noon. And that is that's the extent of the program information related to the RFP, and the ice supplier information, like Kim said, are the next series of slides that you'll receive a copy of. And if you need any support, there's information about how to access technical assistance. And I guess at this point, we are ready for questions.
Great. And Amy, since I know you are presenting, I can take a start on the questions and pass over to you for any additional things that you'd like to add.
Very good. Thank you.
So first question is from Jackie about one of the program requirements being at least one full private bathroom that's accessible for all use by clients. And the question is, does that mean it has to be ADA compliant? Which is a very good question because we don't specify that in the RFP. So we will take that back. We will clarify that in the written amendment. Next question is from Andrew, relative to the Fair Housing Act statement. If there's a location that's serving single adults that identify as or are comfortable in a shelter for females versus those who identify as male in another location, what are the reasonable accommodations available? This is a very good question. We have an outstanding question to HUD technical assistance on this, actually, to make sure that we are sort of in line with fair housing and allocating home ARP funding to single-sex shelters. So hopefully we will have more guidance to share out on that soon. But I will note that only applies to the home ARP funding. It does not apply to the sort of city local funding. Next question is on e-procurement and whether the RFP needs to be submitted in the same login as the RFQ. I do not know. So we will follow up with our contracts team and share that in the share a written response. Next question is, if the project has capacity to expand beds, does DFSS have a plan in place for operating funds for expansion outside of this RFP? Yeah, this is a great question. I think my sort of top line response on this is I don't want us to sort of limit capital projects based on sort of operating funds that are in hand. So I will say we are aware of this need. We are looking to expand bed capacity to the extent that we can. There may be a sort of time lag between when a facility is able to expand beds and when the funding comes through to expand beds, but that is definitely something we're aware of and elevating as a need to our funders. Next question here is, in what way will the restricted use period be documented? So that is still to be determined, but I will say that we are looking to leverage sort of existing processes, like, for example, the DFSS quarterly report, which would demonstrate, that the program served, X number of clients throughout the year. Okay. Next one is on matching funds. And yes, if a potential funder's commitment date is after the end of the RFP deadline, how could we address this? Okay, the IDA funding commitments won't be made until May. Yeah, so I mean, as it's currently written, any matching funds would need to be demonstrated as sort of available by the time of RFP submission. So thanks for flagging that timeline for us. At this point, there's sort of not a method to address that. Is there an estimation of when the provisional awards or grant awards will be made? I don't think we have committed to a timeline, but I think, and some of this I think is dependent on when environmental reviews are completed. But Amy, please feel free to chime in here if you'd like to share a sense of timeline.
My best estimate for when contracts will be executed is towards the end of Q2 in 25.
Great. Okay, yes. Newness of this type of grant on the holidays, any chance of the due date being extended? Appreciate that question. I think we did recognize, we are currently on December 20th, and so had actually extended sort of the typical time period that an RFP is open to account for, the additional work that this RFP submission includes. I think feel free others to also give us feedback if we think it would need to be extended further, but can't make any commitments on that today. Okay, I will give folks a minute. Great, because I figured we might have more questions coming in. Yes, great question. Okay, perfect segue. I'm going to skip ahead to our last slides. I guess I can run through some of this quickly. You've heard these application tips from us before, but start early in the e-procurement platform. Make sure to review the RFP narrative and the questions closely. There is a character limit for each response. And apparently do not use the back button on your browser. The rest of these sort of tips and guidance for working in e-procurement will be included in the slides. But I'm going to go ahead and skip to the end here on just for more information and support as you all are working on the RFP application. So as Amy shared, we are sort of asking for questions by January 3rd. To be submitted, and to submit those questions, just shoot an email to Amy. Her email address is on the slide, and I think folks know it. And then for any sort of non-programmatic questions, you can reach out to either the e-procurement hotline, which contact info is here, or Jillian Black, who's our sort of contracts lead on RFPs here at DFSS. So in short, Andrew, reach out to Amy is the answer to your question. Okay, we'll give a couple more minutes to see if folks had other questions, or Amy, if there's anything you would add to what I shared in response to questions.
I'm not sure if I mentioned that the plan is to share the FAQs and the RFP amendment on January 10th, Friday, January 10th, the week after we're asking that you submit your questions. So that I'm not sure if I mentioned that before. Just wanted to let you know that.
Great. Okay, I'm going to give us 30 more seconds in case anyone's typing. Okay. Well, thank you all so much. Again, apologies for the technical difficulties this morning. Um, Please reach out to Amy or me with questions. Um, and have a very happy holidays, everyone.
Yes, have a happy holidays.
All right. Thank you. Bye all.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye-bye.